Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we are going to take a look at one of the Swedish entrants into the Swedish rifle trials of the late 1950s that eventually would result in adopting the G3 in Sweden. So this is, the designation here is this is an AK, an automatic carbine, FM57. So this is a 1957 pattern rifle. It dates to the beginning of Sweden's new set of trials to adopt a self-loading rifle. So previously, of course, they had developed the Ljungman in 1942, which was a semi-automatic rifle in 6.5 Swede. It had some teething issues. It was generally a good rifle, but by the 1950s, the Swedes were looking for something a little more modern. Now, in the run-up to this, there had been a bunch of experimenting done, in particular by a guy named Erik Wahlberg, who was also the designer of this rifle. He worked for the Carl Gustaf's factory. He'd done a bunch of work experimenting on converting Ljungmans to 7.62 NATO, giving them short-stroke gas piston systems. Like he had one where he replaced its stock with a Carl Gustaf submachine gun stock. This was a prototype of theoretically a Paratrooper's rifle. This guy, our FM57, essentially takes the lessons from all of these other projects and puts them together. And now, instead of this just being sort of a proactive series of experiments by the Carl Gustaf's factory, instead, now this is a formal rifle trial. There are two Swedish entrants into this competition, both of them actually designed by Wahlberg. This is one, the Gram 63, 61, and then 63 was the other one. And then there were 5 foreign entrants. So they were also testing the SIG 510, that's the Sturmgewehr 57. They tested the M14, they tested the FAL, they tested the G3, and I believe they tested the AR-10 as well. So it was a very wide-ranging trial. Now, this is one of the Swedish entrants that, well, spoiler, didn't get adopted. But let's go ahead and take a closer look at this. Let me show you what they did, because it is in many ways a follow-on to this sort of Paratrooper project. Sorry for the interruption, just want to say that today's video is brought to you by Headstamp Publishing, with an extensive catalog of books on all sorts of interesting and esoteric small arms, everything from World War II small arms to Imperial Japanese swords to the earliest of revolvers and Cold War battle rifles. There is something at Headstamp for every firearms enthusiast. Check it out, links in the description text below. So you can see here, we are, with this rifle, getting into the Swedish Green phase, where they painted everything green. Like I said, this is an upgrade from the previous version of Paratrooper rifle. This stock is much more sophisticated. So you can check out my full video on this rifle if you like, but they went from a totally standard Carl Gustaf grip to a much more contoured, much more comfortable grip. And they substantially reinforced, there we go, you can see that better, substantially reinforced the buttstock to make it stronger. All right, it's hard to get good information on these Swedish rifles from this period. There's not much written. Some of what is written is contradictory, but these markings on this particular gun give us one really good piece of information. Actually, they give us a couple of really good pieces of information. So this was almost certainly built up as a Ljungman from spare parts that were never originally built into a rifle, because we have one of the later 1945 production receivers that doesn't appear to have ever gotten a serial number. Instead, it has this 1/57, which I expect is January 1957, and we'll get into that why in just a moment. Now, if I get the lighting right, you can see that this originally, the bolt had like a 15,000 serial number, but that has been sort of scrubbed off, and in its place, there we go, we have 1/57 again. So I suspect this was another leftover surplus available part used to build up the Ljungman elements of this rifle that is sort of a hybrid half Ljungman at this point. On the cast aluminum lower receiver, we do have a serial number, and that is 18. So that's why I think this isn't serial number 1. I think this is January 57, and it's one of 18. It's the 18th of these guns that was manufactured. Also, worth pointing out, on the opposite side of the receiver, normally we would expect an SS, the initials of the inspecting officer at Carl Gustafstad. There is no inspection stamp here, so that furthers the idea that this was a leftover, like a spare parts receiver used to build this rifle. We have one more really valuable marking, and that's on the magazine. AK FM/57 with a Crown C for Carl Gustaf and a serial number 1. So this really specifies the model designation for us, which in turn really helps nail down the exact year. The timeline of these rifles is a little hazy. There are a lot of them out there that purport these to be like the original 7.62 NATO conversions to be from 1959. I think that time scale is off. I think this really points to the original Swedish NATO conversions being done in like 1954, maybe 55. By 57, the system is pretty well in place. Now, unfortunately, all the parts on this rifle are extremely tightly assembled, and I can't get the gas system or the lower receiver off to show you guys the internals. But what we have here is very clearly the exact same gas system that was used on those 7.62 NATO conversions, even though this particular rifle is actually still chambered for 6.5 by 55. So we have an adjustable gas plug here. There's a short stroke piston underneath there, which comes back to this point right here. And you can see the end of the piston right there instead of the protruding gas tube from one of the original gas impingement Ljungmans. The magazine for this rifle is also very similar to the magazine on this earlier Paratrooper conversion. So that one is a push straight in, like just load it straight up into the magwell style. This one is a nose in and rock back pattern. Fix right there, nose in, rock back. However, you can see that these are exactly the same style of magazine body being used. They just have different attachment methods at the front. So the FM57 has this big slug assembly thing on the front to hold it into the front of the magazine well. In fact, if we zoom in a bit here, you can see that the bottom one, which is our FM57, which is in 6.5 Swede, is longer than our 7.62 NATO magazine here, which actually has a spacer in the very front. Quick look at the stock for you. We have a locking latch right here. If you push that out, you can then crack the stock and it just folds around to the inside. In theory, you could shoot it with the stock folded, but you know, there's no particular reason to. This definitely makes the gun a little bit more compact, but it's still going. It's still a pretty long, bulky rifle. Note that there is no muzzle device on it. Some of the early 7.62 NATO conversions had a big old flash hider. It also doesn't have the muzzle brake holes of an original Ljungman, which is kind of an interesting thing to note. All right, now there is one interesting element here inside the bolt carrier. So let me disassemble this. So the dust cover and spring are normal. Note we have the coiled mainspring of the AG42B upgrade. But if I pull the bolt carrier off, inside there we actually have this sort of sheet metal spring. And when I have the bolt in place, that is actively pushing the bolt downward all the time. And downward is the in battery position. So that's the out of battery position when it's traveling. You can see I have to push it up into position. So it's always pushing on the bolt, trying to push it down into that locked position. Why exactly they needed this, I'm not sure. I haven't seen anything like this on any of the other any of the other Ljungman prototypes from this period that I've looked at. So that helps keep the bolt in battery, I suppose. Although I didn't realize that there was any real problem with the bolt staying in battery. Well, anyway, there's your one unexpected feature inside the gun. So the FM57 doesn't make it initially in trials, but there's enough time here, the trials wouldn't end. There wouldn't be a rifle adopted until 1964. So there are several rounds of different trials going on. And after this, Wahlberg revamped the gun as the FM57/60. Made a couple of changes. He changed the caliber from 6.5 up to 7.62 NATO, that seemed to be the way things were going. Gave it a new style of sights, gave it a normal style of bolt handle instead of using the legacy Ljungman system with the weird bolt cover latching closing deal. That ultimately was still not enough, and the 57/60 didn't make the final round of trials. In fact, the final round of trials was the Grom 63, so still one of Wahlberg's guns, and then the FN FAL and the HK G3. And of course, in 1964, the G3 was chosen. It would be adopted as the AK-4 in Swedish military service and served for several decades. So very cool to get a chance to take a look at one of these. These are extremely scarce guns. I don't know exactly how many were made originally, but not a whole lot. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.